When I was a graduate student, I was really interested in this question of why do people vote? And the interesting thing about that time was political scientists were very influenced by economists and thinking about this like it was a cost-benefit calculation, like I'm going to buy a loaf of bread. And I just didn't feel like that was the right way to go about the question. And so I started reading this great work from the 1950s about how one person's vote could be predicted by whether or not their family member voted or whether or not their friend voted. But the effect sizes are really small. Like if your friend voted, you were a little more likely to vote. And so I thought, well, that can't really explain why millions of people vote. How would we get up to those kinds of numbers? And I remember sort of racking my brain and falling asleep one night. And I remember this commercial from the 1970s where this woman, she becomes so enthralled with her shampoo that she says she tells two friends and the screen splits into two. And then she tells two friends, each of them tells them and it splits into four, and then so on and so on and so on. And soon there are all these women that are enthralled with their shampoo. And I realized in that moment that we had spent so much time thinking about how one person influences another without thinking about how it continued beyond our social horizon. And I got really, really excited the next day, and I told my advisor about the shampoo girl. And he kind of scratched his head, but it was a new idea. He was willing to give it a shot, and he introduced me to Nicholas Christakis, who's now professor at Yale, who was really interested in the same kind of question for health effects. And probably the best thing that ever had to happen to me in my career was having an idea that forced me outside of my discipline. Something that wasn't going to be doing what everybody else was doing at the time, which was these economic models, but putting me into a whole new space where physicists and applied mathematicians and sociologists and computer scientists were all working together to understand the internet and all of these new great data resources about how we're all connected to each other. So I always hesitate to describe myself because I feel like the moment I describe myself, I put myself in a box and then I'm not going to be allowed to go outside of the box. But there are patterns in the things that I do. I'm really interested in social connectivity. And the main way that that's expressed these days is in terms of social networks. Now, Nicholas Christakis and I, we started studying this before Facebook, before Friendster, before we had these online manifestations of social networks. So we were really studying the face-to-face connections, the people that we spend our free time with, the people that we discuss important matters with. And what has been really interesting is that we sort of developed a framework for understanding these real-world networks at a time when there was growing interest by the public in what was going on online. And I think one of the reasons why we're so fascinated with what has been going on online is it is this manifestation of something that's very deep, that's very ancient in terms of our desire to connect to other people. And so social networks has really been a big theme, but built on top of that, one of the things that we do as a species more than other species is that we cooperate with people that are not our mates and not our kin. We'll actually give stuff up and give it away, or we'll trust other people that maybe we haven't met before. And that's unusual. Most other species that are social, the reason why they're social is because they're connected to other family members. So ants, for example, they're all half siblings with one another. And so deeply connected to this idea of social networks is this idea of altruism and of cooperation and of a biological basis potentially for those things, which is one of the things that has led me to do work in genetics, for example, comparing identical twins who are 100% the same versus fraternal twins that are only 50% the same, or even looking at specific genes to try to better understand human behavior. So I have to tell you, this last weekend, I got a chance to be on a panel at the World Science Festival with Steven Strogatz, whom I had never met before. And unbeknownst to him, he's the person that started my journey into social networks. He published a paper with Duncan Watson in Nature in 1998. Or maybe it was in Science, I can't remember. But he published a really important paper on small world networks. And in that paper, they showed how this one statistical model, it could explain the internet. It could explain the way the electrical grid is connected. It could explain how neurons are connected in small single-cell organisms. It could explain how people were connected. And so I was really, really excited at this idea that that some of the things that I was interested in politics, if I learned how to characterize that system, I might be able to say something not just about people, not just about politics, but about all these other things in science, that we could reach out and not only learn things from the natural sciences, but to teach things to natural scientists. And so that paper had a huge, huge effect on me. And I had to tell Stephen Strogatz, I said, you know, I can't believe what an honor it is to be on this panel with you, because if there were no Stephen Strogatz, I don't know what I'd be studying. I probably wouldn't be studying social networks, because that was such an important paper. So we know that there are different kinds of friends that we have. There's some people that we're really tight with. We see them all the time. We trust them with everything. And there are other people, we might see them once in a while, and we'll communicate with them once in a while. We don't think about them very often. And so there's this way of characterizing these relationships, which is the strength of a tie. And one of the interesting things that happened in sociology around 1970 or so was that there was a lot of research about how we were coming unglued as a society. People were moving into cities. They were losing contact with their strong ties, their families, and the friendships they formed in small village life. And instead, they were thrust into the situation where they had all of these anonymous interactions with people that they barely knew. And so there was this real worry that we were becoming alienated as a society. And at that point in time, Mark Granovetter was reacting against all of this when he was thinking about social ties. He's a sociologist who's now at Stanford. And he was thinking, well, it's true that we don't have such strong connections with people now, but maybe there are some benefits to that. And so he wrote this great paper called The Strength of Weak Ties, where he thought about what is it that you get out of an interaction with a stranger. And one of the things that he hypothesized was that we actually are able to learn more new things from people who aren't our close friends. Because the problem is that your strong ties, your close friends, you'll share stories with them, and at a certain point you run out of stories. Or you might share information with them, and I'm sure that everyone has experienced this at least once, where you tell a friend something, and then the friend forgets that you told them, and then they tell it back to you. And so all this information, it's the same information that's circulating in these strong ties. Well, maybe to get new information, what you really need to do is you need to talk to someone that you don't know so well. And in that original paper, one of the things that Granovetter found was that people, for example, who got jobs were more likely to get their jobs via someone that they didn't know so well than via someone that they did know very, very well. And so this is where this idea of the strength of weak ties came from. So Mark Granovetter has his paper, The Strength of Weak Ties, which is very important in showing us why weak ties are important. One of the reasons why they're important in theory is that that's a way for you to get new information. And this actually spawned other great research by people like Brian Uzi, who was interested in teamwork. One of the things that he wanted to know is who amongst academics is producing the best research? Who amongst Broadway producers is producing the best musicals? And he had this idea that the way the groups are formed might have something to do with the outcomes. And so he thought about teams in terms of this mix of strong and weak ties. You can imagine that if you are investing in a Broadway musical, you have a couple of options. One extreme option is you can go and find some team that already made a great hit, and you just say, do it again, give me the sequel. And so that's one strategy. Another strategy is instead of doing that, you go and take one person from that team, and you go find another team that was successful, and you take a person from that team and a person from another team, all these people who were part of successful teams, and you bring them together. This is the dream team approach, which we all have some skepticism about, given the origin of that term in the Basketball Olympics in the United States team. So there are these two extremes where nobody knows each other, everybody knows each other. And his hypothesis was that actually, because you get new information from weak ties, but you also get trust from strong ties, maybe you need a combination of those two things. And that's exactly what he found. It was the teams that had a mix of people who had already worked together and who some of whom they had not worked together, that produced the best Broadway musicals, both in terms of critical acclaim, the number of stars they get in reviews, and in terms of the amount of money that they make. And he also has found this amongst academics, that if groups of academics keep pumping out the same papers, that's not as valuable as some of those people moving on and working with different teams. And those teams are also more valuable than trying to put a bunch of people who haven't worked together into a collaboration together. So that's one piece of research that I think was really benefited from Mark Granovetter's early work. Now, we've actually revisited Mark Granovetter's paper at scale using Facebook data. And this is a paper that we're writing up now, where what we do, instead of looking at a small number of people and asking them where they got their jobs, we look at millions of people online who went to go work where one of their friends worked previously. And we found that for a subsample of these, about 60% of the people who ended up working where their friends work, they got help from that friend. So it's the same kind of thing that Mark Granovetter was studying. But we look at this in millions of people across 55 countries, and we find the same thing, that most people tend to get help finding a job from someone that they aren't very close to. But we think the reason why this is true is not because they have new information, it's because we have a lot more weak ties. And so the average person on Facebook has about 150 friends, for example, and only 10 of those are likely to be really close, deep social relationships that we have with people in real life. And so it's not surprising that those other 140 people actually ended up helping out more in terms of quantity. And in fact, one of the things that we find is that when you look at how effective a given person is, that the stronger your ties to that person, the more you communicate with them, the more comments and likes and photos and things like that, or the more friends you share in common with that person, the more likely you are to actually get help from that person in finding a job. And so on the one hand, I think it really illustrates that this study that Mark Granovetter did in the early 1970s was right. On the other hand, I think it's giving us new insight into these mechanisms online, especially in a context where we really are connected directly to a much larger number of people now than we ever have been. Reputation. So this is actually a big topic in computer science. And one of the reasons why is because they're very interested in reputation, because they want to avoid interacting with spammers or interacting with people who are trying to exploit you in some way. In social systems, reputation can be very important because it's at the core of a lot of theories of cooperation and of trust. And so the idea is you may not know someone at first and you don't know anything about them through your personal interactions, but maybe you learn about that person from somebody else, from some interaction that they had with that person. And so networks are a perfect way to study this, because what the network is showing you is what are all the different paths where that kind of information could flow. And so we get out of this some things that are sort of duh, we already knew that in real life moments, like if you want to have a positive interaction with somebody, you probably shouldn't harm someone who they're directly connected to, because they're going to find out about that, and your reputation will be harmed. But there's other things that I think we haven't thought about before, which is it's not just the direct connections that matter, it's the indirect connections that matter. And you have theoreticians like Martin Nowak who have actually studied this explicitly in terms of human cooperation, that indirect reputations and how those messages can spread throughout a social network, even though it might need to go through a large number of steps, there's still some chance that you're going to find out about something bad that somebody did. And so one of the nice things that we're exploring now, and I think there's still a lot of open questions, is what kinds of network structures make it easiest for you to find out the reputations of people that you've never interacted with before. You can imagine from an evolutionary point of view that one of the reasons why our social networks are structured the way they are now is because we have an optimal way to find out this kind of information, to know who to cooperate with and who not to. Because if, as a species, we could reinforce cooperation, then we could be much more successful in our competition with other species than we otherwise might not have been. We have actually studied the question of how to make things go viral from a structure point of view. And what I mean by that is we're trying to figure out, just based on who's connected to whom, who should we target in the network in order to make sure a message gets to as many people as possible. And so one intuition that people have sometimes is that you need to find the person who has the most number of connections, right? So maybe you need to make sure that Justin Bieber is the person that sends out your tweet. And what we have found is actually contrary to that. It's a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that people who have many of these kinds of connections, they also are harder to reach. It's harder to get someone like that to change their behavior. And also, when you have 1 million friends or 10 million friends or however many it is that Justin Bieber has these days, each one of those relationships is extremely weak, extremely weak. And so you can imagine a situation where someone online has, say, 1,000 connections, but that person really cultivates all those connections and actually interacts with everybody and has conversations with them. You can imagine that person actually being more powerful than someone who has 1 million followers and never gives that back and forth with any one of those followers. And that's exactly what we find in our research on Facebook, where we look to see how voting messages spread during the 2010 and the 2012 elections. We found that when Facebook sends you a message, that there's a chance that you'll share it with your close friends, but there's very little chance that you share it with your friends that aren't so close, your weak ties. And so as a result, Facebook can be a good medium for spreading messages and for getting people to actually change their real-world voting behavior, for example. But it does so through this sequence of real-world ties. It's the people that you're close to in real life. And they're all there on Facebook. But it's a much smaller set of people than every single one of these connections. And so now what you need to find is, instead of the person who has 10 million followers, you need to find the person who has the largest number of these strong ties, where they can ignite these cascades, where 10 people becomes 100, becomes 1,000. Another thing that I'll say about this is that Duncan Watts has done some very interesting work on these cascades. And one of the things that he always counters is that a lot of our research has been about the success stories. Okay, so if you want to know what makes something go viral, the tendency is to want to go and study things like Gangnam Style. Let's see, how did that go viral in the first place? And his point is, if you want to understand the successes, you also have to study the failures. And there are a lot of failures. In fact, 99.99, you can go out as many nines as you want. There are so many people that are trying to make things go viral all the time, and there's very, very little that actually goes viral. And so it's not just the structure that matters, because the structure is going to tell you that most of these things are going to fail. It's also the content that matters. And here I really like work by Jonah Berger. He wrote a book called Contagious. And he's really studied this question of what makes things go viral. And my favorite result of his is that messages that contain a sense of awe are messages that are more likely to spread from one person to another. So things that, for religious people, contain language about God. For everyone, that contain language about nature or about the immensity of the universe. Those are the kinds of things that he finds in New York Times articles and elsewhere are more likely to be shared and have this "she told's two friends" kind of effect. Advice is a very difficult question, because I'm not sure that there really is any one-size-fits-all solution. UCSD is a fantastic place with all kinds of different people. We educate great artists and great engineers and poets and scientists, sociologists. There's just so many different kinds of groups of people that we really are able to help, and who really give back to the community in lots of different ways. I would say that one of the things that might cut across all of these different groups of people who are graduating, who are this age, is I would want them to make sure not to succumb to pressures to conform. This is the perfect time of your life to take risks. When I was this age, when I graduated, I went into the Peace Corps. And I was scared to death, going to a new culture, trying to learn a new language, trying to figure out how I was going to help people. It's not something that would be so easy for me to do at my age now. There are people who do it at my age, but I respect them even more for having done it. When you graduate, when you're young, when you have that opportunity, you might be thinking, oh, I have all this college debt. Oh, mom and dad say I need to go get a real job. And maybe this is exactly the time that you should go have an adventure, that you should go try something new. And because most of the people that I've talked to who have done that have said it was the most important choice that they ever made.